Right, so hello KGS. Welcome back to KGS Music Appreciation over here. I thought I'd do something a little new this week because I'm sure you're all getting tired of hearing me just yak about music theory, music history back and forth. So I thought I would let you hear from somebody else, someone who was also very heavily involved in all kinds of fields. Rather, he's kind of a jack of all trades, a composer, a conductor, an arranger, a music teacher, an astronaut, a cosmonaut, all kinds of things here. So here's my friend Brandon Rolle. And thank you so much, Brandon, for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what I thought I would do is just ask you a couple of interesting, curious questions that a lot of non-musicians actually had, because that's, because what we do is usually kind of an odd thing for people. I feel a lot of people usually confuse what a conductor is and what a composer is. That's the most common question I get is, when you conduct something, are you conducting your own works?
Right.
So I thought once and for all, we would just hash this out, conductor versus composer, get both of our points of view here. And we'll just kind of see where the conversation veers off to.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. So first things first, kind of how did you get into composition? What has been your, your pathway, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think among sort of classically trained composers, my path was maybe a little bit different than a lot of people's. I actually started as a jazz musician
Really?
when I was much younger. Yeah, I was trained as a jazz guitarist. I also played some jazz piano. And then I did a lot of jazz arranging when I was in college. And I also needed to, just because of the way the program was, I also had to do a degree in classical guitar performance. And so because of that, I started getting more and more introduced to the classical repertoire and also playing in sort of different contexts other than the jazz combo. And I actually continued to do primarily jazz and jazz performance specifically through college until I was out of college. I had written a handful of pieces, but it wasn't my main practice at that point. And then I actually had really bad wrist problems.
Really?
And I started having to ice my wrist all the time with guitar, and it just became apparent to me that it wasn't going to be a long-term thing that I could do. And so at some point after doing the jazz and classical guitar gigging thing, I just, I started writing more and more as I started being able to play less and less. And it kind of happened naturally. I was looking for something to do when I, like so many people, when I finished my undergraduate degree with degrees in music and political science. So not the most useful degrees on earth. And I thought, what am I going to do? And an old contact of mine got in touch and basically set up Mark Applebaum, who was teaching composition at Stanford at the time, was incredibly kind and just said, why don't you come audit these classes? Just come sit in. So I sat in for, I think, a year on his doctoral composition seminar and just totally was amazed and had my mind blown about the detail and level of craft that these composers were doing. And so talking to him at some point, he has suggested that if I was interested in composition and the sort of things that I was interested in doing, that the person to study with would be Pauline Oliveros over at Mills, and that they had some incredible faculty there. So of course, like a young, stupid person, I only applied to Mills for their master's in composition, and I happened to get in. And then from there, became very clear to me that was the thing I was meant to do. I always had a hard time practicing for endless hours, but I could write and write and write, and really felt that I was like, learning something each time and really enjoying the process. So so it wasn't until probably a year or two out of my undergraduate degree that I switched to composing full time.
Really?
Yeah,
that's actually really interesting, because my pathway was not radically very different from that. So I started actually in piano performance, and I started actually pretty late. I mean, I was playing piano maybe for real, I think, starting at around 10. Whereas, probably with guitar as well, if you want to actually pursue a performance career, you can't start in your teens.
Right.
There's just no way you can actually build that kind of technique.
Right.
And I got into conducting again randomly. So at the time, this was after piano, I was studying medieval musicology. I was doing all that, all that kind of stuff. And a professor just said, hey, you know what? For some reason, I think you might have a knack for this instead. I guess he could kind of see that, yeah, maybe musicology wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
You know, and I just kind of got into it after undergrad.
Yeah.
Which is composition and conducting, I think, are probably the only two musical enterprises that you can begin at a later date.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, because I think they require a basis in performance of some type. I think it's hard to get into conducting or composing unless you have a really solid background in some type of performance. And so you see people who were great violinists, you know, starting to turn to conducting, or great pianists starting to turn to composing. It's kind of one of the things that I actually really admire about those two fields too, because you don't feel necessarily like you're behind because you didn't start when you were 5 years old.
In terms of conducting, I mean, yeah, you don't feel like you're behind because everyone else is more or less kind of where you are at that age.
Right.
You know, but when you, as a young conductor, when you step up in front of an orchestra that's incredibly experienced and it's obvious that you're not, man, do you feel it.
Right.
You feel it tough. I don't know if it's the same for composition.
Yeah, I mean, I think early on, that's one of the awkward things about composing is when you start writing, it's all about getting your ideas onto paper. Mm-hmm. And that's a really amazing thing because what you're learning is sort of internal. It's how to translate the ideas into this written format of musical notation, how to translate it into that language. But then at some point, as you start working with better and better musicians, which, you know, for most people is if they're at a conservatory in their undergraduate or otherwise maybe in their graduate program, you start working with really talented performers, and then you realize there's this whole other level beyond translating your ideas to the paper. Your ideas on paper then have to translate to these performance practices that instrumentalists have spent their entire lives working on. And so it's a similar thing to what you're expressing with the conducting. When you're composing, you start to work with higher and higher level performers. It's this really eye-opening experience of like, whoa, there's this repertoire and this performance practice that you have to master in order to be able to really communicate with those instrumentalists.
Yeah, it is a humbling process either way.
Yeah,
I think it takes a really, really long time for both of these fields where you get to the point to be incredibly, not just comfortable, but confident to talk to a musician about their own instrument. I think that's the biggest challenge for me because I'm a pianist, obviously. I have the instinct of a pianist. I can talk to a piano player about, you know, try this fingering or try this position or try whatever, or this isn't written well.
Right.
You know, I can say that for piano.
Right.
But no matter how much work I do to learn how to bow on an instrument or how to breathe with the wind or a brass instrument or so on, I'll never have that instinct.
No, you know? No. I mean, it's one of the things that's always funny as a conductor is when you stand up in front of an orchestra, it's like you're the worst person on every one of those instruments, right, in the room, and yet you're in charge. And I think with composing, we have a little bit of a similar problem that I think sometimes happens in conducting, which is, and I tell like my comp students this sometimes, it's helpful if you can give the performer some indication that you've done the work. And I think early on in the score, if you notate things in a way, if you write things in a way that are idiomatic or at least seem cognizant of the repertoire, of the history of that instrument, then a player is more likely to say, oh, okay, and go along with on the ride for you. I think when you come out of the gates and try to demand something of a player that as though you were the authority on their instrument, from a composition standpoint, they're not going to go with you. And there's a trend, I think, that I've noticed with especially young American composers to get back to English, to not necessarily use the Italian and the German and the French in terms of expressive markings.
Yeah, that can get a little tedious.
Well, and it's also, if you're not really, really comfortable with where those terms are coming from and the repertoire that they're sort of referring to, then they're meaningless, and you'd be better off to say exactly what you mean in the language that is natural to you. And I think players pick that up, and I think they respect it. At least that's in chamber and contemporary music. That's always sort of been my sense.
Well, this kind of leads me actually into the first question that I had. So this is coming from a conductor, like a fellow musician, which is, in conducting specifically, I know what to call a wrong answer. Like if I'm teaching a student, I can tell for sure, okay, this is why something didn't work. Your hand wasn't positioned correct. You weren't on the right beat. You weren't looking at the right instrument. You gave a wrong comment with wrong language, so on. So I have a kind of a framework to judge the right or wrong answer for that field. And
Mm.
something I've always wondered for composition,
Mm-hmm.
you can, there are right or wrong answers in terms of ranges of instruments. You can't write this low, you can't write this high. It's like very, very foundational things.
Right.
But when you're teaching composition or when you're learning composition, either way, what is a framework for saying this is incorrect or this can be improved or not? I mean, what is taught, I guess?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think this may be one of the things that varies a lot from, composer to composer, but I can tell you, at least in my teaching, the thing that I found very effective when I was a student and that I've tried to make sort of the centerpiece of my teaching is the principle of nothing is neutral. And we talk about this in conducting too, right? The idea of like all your motions either help or take away from the clarity of the gesture.
Yeah.
And you have to be aware which it's doing. Are you just creating busyness, or are you making the gesture clear? And I think it's the same thing with composition, which is, it's not about right or wrong, but it's about, are you saying the thing that you're trying to say in the most effective way? So for instance, again, not a right or wrong thing, but if a student comes to me and they have, right out of the gates, a flute on like a triple high C, and I say to them, okay, tell me, with this opening gesture, what is the sound world, the emotion that you want to go for? And they say, oh, I want this really intimate, soft thing. Well, then I can say that note in that range on that instrument out of the gates is not going to be soft and intimate, right? And so they're not effectively communicating the gesture that they're trying to. And so I think when we talk about composition, what we can teach is not right or wrong answers, but we can teach craft, which is how do we get closer and closer to replicating the feeling that we want to create in our brains with how that comes out on paper in a performance and in a score.
Yeah, that's, I mean, like even to a professional musician, the composition world, we can't help but think of it in terms of right and wrong, because that's the only thing we're taught. A right note, a wrong note, a right gesture, a wrong gesture. There's really no, no gray area, I guess, in the middle.
Yeah, I mean,
there is.
I think that's part of the thing that made me fall in love with composition, is that it's not black and white. It's not right or wrong. There's no sort of duality to it. It's this big, messy gray area. And some people embrace that gray and do incredible things with it. I was just listening the other day, actually, to, since we've had a lot of time to listen at home.
I don't know what you mean.
I was listening to the Beethoven, I think it's the fourth piano concerto, G major, right?
Yeah.
And, it's like Beethoven does this incredible thing, which is to start with, it's super weird that the concerto starts with the piano, right? Because there's no orchestral introduction, which you expect. It starts with the piano. And then, whatever it is, 8/16 measures later, after this main sort of idea comes in the piano, the orchestra comes in, but they come in B major. Yep. And it's like, it's totally out of the blue. It's this chromatic mediant relationship. It's like, wait, we just got a couple of measures of the key. What's happening? Like the piano, it's this whole topsy-turvy thing. But at the same time, it works so well.
So for the non-musicians out there, we talked about this in the very first video on what is tonality, why you start in one key, you depart from that key, you come back to that key. So now here's an example of the Beethoven Fourth, and there are many others where you don't start in that key. You start in some other completely random key, and then you go to another random key. That's the kind of a tonal narrative that you can also create.
Yeah, and it's spectacular, because I think, it is that craft, and it's about how do you frame something successfully, how do you execute it successfully. And if you take an example like that, where you have this introduction, it's not what you expect, and then the strings come in, you're like, how do we end up in B major? And then 8 measures later, you're back in G major, you're back in your home key, and you don't even really know how it happened. And I think that's the thing that really moves me with composers, is the craft of setting you up to be like, what's happening, and then walking you through how that resolves in their head. And it's so effective. And I think that's part of the reason that certain composers like Beethoven have remained so important to the repertoire, is that they understood human psychology, human cognition better than anyone else. They always make you feel in hindsight like the thing they were going to do was inevitable, but in the moment that it happened, it felt like a surprise. And that's an incredible tool of craft for a composer to have. So to get back to your original question, when we're talking about teaching composition, I don't think it's so much about right and wrong, but it's about that effect. Are you trying to create something that is slowly becoming something else? You're trying to create something that's a shock, that turns on a dime. Are you doing that in the most effective way you can? And those are the sort of tools that I think mark development for a composer.
Yeah. Well, here's a question that I've always had, and it might be a little bit esoteric, but things like tonality, things like key relationships, things like musical form, which are things that we've talked about now in this series so far. Are those things intrinsic? Are they inherent? Are they genetic in a way to the human condition, or are they just taught? If we had taught them a completely different way and we were accustomed to that way, would we still be talking about them like this? Or do they hit something at the somehow genetic or human core? And I don't even know if I can expect an answer to that, but that's something that I've always thought about.
I mean, with tonality, I'll say I think that there's a fair amount of research that in different temperaments, but equal temperaments, a pretty decent approximation of the harmonic series. There's, it's not a pure intonation in the sense of the intervals being pure 2-to-1, 3-to-2, 4-to-3 ratios, but it is fairly good at giving us something that has a lot of intervals, and important intervals, like the fifth, for instance, that are relatively close, octaves, which are more or less perfect, and then a way to transpose without things becoming really, really wonky. So I don't think it's completely arbitrary. I think that there are just physiologically certain ratios and intervals that create more dissonance and create more consonance. And I think that the various tonal systems of both Western and Eastern types of music play into that.
Interestingly enough, actually, I just read a book on intonation, and Kepler, this is back in the 15th century, did an experiment where he calculated the arc in planetary motion. He took one planet, Saturn, I think it was,
right,
and he calculated the arc of the movement of that planet when it was closest to the sun and when it was farthest from the sun. And he took that ratio, like 136 by 102, something like that. And it came out to be 3-to-2. And then Mars came out to be 4-to-3.
Interesting.
So all of the ratios, the fundamental ratios of intervals within a diatonic tonal system were somehow mirrored in planetary motion.
Yeah, I mean,
that's just odd.
There's really great, there's a book called Music and Mathematics that I had suggested to a student recently that talks about all sorts of relationships. There's so much there. I mean, even I think on the one hand, there's a lot of research about tonality and pitch and consonance and dissonance, but even with things like orchestration, which we think about in terms of like building an intuition of what things sound good, there's a lot more built-in psychoacoustic basis to that. Like, we will teach students, you leave big gaps at the bottom of the orchestra, like between the basses and the cellos, and sort of as you get higher in pitch, you can get closer and closer. Well, we actually hear the higher pitches. We have much finer hearing up there. So what a fifth in the lowest registers between the basses and the cellos feels like a second or a third between the flutes, because we hear much more detail up in the flute register. So I think that in some ways there's this intuition, but that intuition is also informed by a lot of physiological mechanisms, mechanisms of the ear, of the brain, things like that. And then when it comes to form, in a more abstract sense, not just sound like with pitch, but with form, I mean, I think it really, as a composer at least, I'm very aware of tonality and form when I compose, even if I'm not writing a tonal piece.
That's what I was going to actually ask next. How does tonality and form, or not just form in general, but specifically, let's say the Baroque or the classical forms, binary, ternary, sonata, allegro form, do all those concepts still play, let's say, an operating principal role in your composition, or are they basically extinct at this point?
I mean, they certainly do for me. I know they do for a lot of composers. For tonality, I'll say that it may not be in this piece is going to be in G major sort of way, but the sense of when we add leading tones, when we move up the circle of fifths, we're creating tension, right? C going to G, going to D, it has a certain tension like a rubber band that wants to come back. When we remove leading tones from a key, when we take away that most important dissonance, and we move down the cycle of fifths instead from C to F, for instance, that relieves pressure. And in tonal world like Bach, you'll often see that you move up through the circle of fifths early in the piece to build some tension. At the end of the piece, you'll often go to the subdominant, moving down by fifth to instead relieve tension.
Right.
I think those principles on a local scale stay really important because people hear them. So that's still in my mind, even if I'm not writing in a very specific key, is when I introduce chromatics, what does that voice leading suggest? Is that creating the effect I want it to create? And in terms of form, form is one of the more important things in my music because I think that's how people turn sounds into a piece in their brain, right? And so, the sonata form, for instance, did you talk about sonata form?
I did, yeah, that was our last video.
For me, sonata form is one of the most important forms because there's this really fundamental thing about, I'm going to give you a little idea. I'm going to repeat it so you know it's important. Then I'm going to go off and change it and liquidate it and do all these different things to develop it. And then I'm going to come back to it. And it's the way that we write, right? This rhetoric is the way we write. We give an introduction where we say in the abstract, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to outline all the points for you. Then you go point by point and break it down. And you come back at the end and say, cool, this is what I just explained to you. And so I think there's a basic thing about we like to take in information that way. When you repeat something, it becomes important. And so this idea of repetition, variation, and then coming back for me is a really basic sort of fundamental way of communicating information.
Well, it's also something that we kind of mirror, let's say, in other art forms. For example, film is one that I always like to come back to. It's like watching a film with no acts,
right? Essentially,
or no scenes. It's all just one continuous stream. It's like you don't understand what language it's in after a while.
Yeah. Well, and also we need landmarks, right? We need landmarks. And I think so much of music, at least so much of the traditional repertoire, comes from an understanding of melody that is basically straight out of the vocal tradition. And to me, it makes sense that you have a vocal line that starts somewhere, it goes up to a climax, and then it comes back down. And that form, in about the length that you can breathe, we're really used to hearing.
Yeah.
If you want to communicate an idea, you want to communicate it on one breath. And so then we have these melodic lines, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dee-dum, ya-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum-bum. And the breaths are totally there, even though it's not voice. And so I think that it's like that's one mode of understanding. We want to understand things in a way that we usually communicate through voice, and then that sort of bleeds into the instrumental thing. And then on the bigger level, it's like, okay, so now if we've had a sentence and I really want to drive it home, you got to find a way to repeat that material.
Yeah.
And then you can get away from it. But once you've gotten away from it too long, we've forgotten where we were. And then when you come back to it, it feels like getting home. And it's a little bit like taking a walk around your neighborhood where you start and end at your house, but each time you go a little bit further and explore. And when I'm listening, at least, that's sort of the feeling that I have.
Well, it's crucial. It's crucial to know what is happening before you're listening.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the points of this music appreciation series is if you go into a concert hall, or if you're just listening at home, it doesn't really matter. And you don't know that there are principles at work in that piece, like tonality, like departing from a key, like introducing material in this section, doing something with the material here, reintroducing or recapitulating it again. It's going to be like watching a film without knowing the language.
Yeah, of course.
It's just one long stream of information, and you're trying to latch on to whatever you possibly can at any given moment. You're not going to get much out of it,
And I think this is one of the things that's hard about concert music is that if you're in a concert and you're getting one pass to listen to it, right? A great composer will make the audience feel like the world's best listener, because they will walk you through the journey that you want to have, where you're going, oh my gosh, I'm hearing all these connections to that opening theme. And then 10 minutes later, you're like, where are we? And then at the end, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that thing coming back. I mean, the composer, it may feel like magic, but the composer made that happen with very, very
has to be a conscious process.
concrete, practical things.
Right.
Yeah. And I think with other styles of music, like minimalism, you know, one of the things that people, I think a lot of maybe not so versed in classical music audiences ended up really connecting to in minimalism was that it doesn't ask that. You don't have to be along for the journey, because often in minimalism, the repeating textures let you notice slight shifts in the timbre or orchestration. And that more micro evolution of a piece is much easier to follow because it's more moment.
Pressure off your brain a little bit.
Yeah, you're not having to remember that theme in A that was maybe 15 minutes ago earlier in the movement. So there are different types of rhetoric, but I think they both play on the same sort of thing, which is like, is the composer shining a spotlight on the thing they want you to hear?
Mm-hmm.
And
well, here, let's take it. So we've been to the planet so far and back. Let's take it back down to Earth a little bit. So here's a question, and this is actually from my wife Maria. She was dying to ask this one. So when somebody commissions a work, how much detail do they provide on exactly what they want? Are they incredibly specific, or do you do more of the asking?
Gosh, it totally depends.
And I was just going to say, because you and I were recently talking about possibly commissioning a work, and I was thinking to myself, okay, well, what did I actually ask? I said, okay, it's going to be for this concert. Here's how long I basically want it to be. So I gave you a length of time.
Right.
Here's the instrumentation, ideally, that I'd like it to be for. And maybe the theme of that concert, I think I also gave you something along the lines. So you had some kind of a character foundation to what you were writing. But after that, I said, more power to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
whatever happens.
In my experience, at least, I think I'm kind of lucky because I'm early enough in my career that it's a bit of a mix. I suspect that this would be different for someone who's 30 years into their career and they've been doing the same sort of thing for a while. But for me, I can say, yeah, it really depends. Sometimes, like when I was a lot younger, I did a lot of work for fixed media. So like, especially doing short films, things like that. Mm-hmm. And even recently, like I did an audio video project with Christopher Richmond, who's a video artist out here. And with those situations, it's always, first of all, usually they find you because they've heard something else of yours. Yeah. Like Christopher had heard a string quartet, this like Italian string quartet that had performed one of my works. So when he came to me, I already knew what the sort of sound world was that had attracted him in the first place, which is helpful because we talked about length and technology and how many speakers, and I would get, cuts of the film, but I always knew what was his entry point into my music that he liked. And I was able to sort of talk with him about that and have a sense of it. And there's some freedom in that because it's my language. There's other times where, like the orchestra piece that I just did, as part of this residency, they told me the other pieces on the program. And then there's also the level of the orchestra. There's, of course, things like the instrumentation and the length. But artistically, there was like the performance level of the players, what else is on the program, the other sort of things that they've been performing, right? So I know, okay, well, they probably have this in their hands because they were doing Stravinsky or whatever, right?
Right.
And so that gave me a lot of sort of specific guidelines about what is this piece going to be like. This group really doesn't like electronics, so it's got to have some grounding in our modernist roots. And it's like, okay, cool. So 20th century modernist music, like, got it. And then other times people are looking for something very, very specific. So for me, at least right now, it really runs the gamut. And I enjoy that because the process is a little bit different each time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, here's a question. Has there ever been a situation where you've written the work and whoever commissioned it said, look, this is not what I asked for. I'm sorry, but I don't want it.
No, thankfully that has not happened. Well,
I hope I didn't jinx it just now. Yeah.
I know, right? I know. It hasn't happened out loud. I will say I used to work a lot with choreographers. And I think choreographers and film directors sometimes have a similar thing, which is this. When they're dancing or they're editing, doing early cuts, oftentimes they'll work with temp music.
Yeah.
And so the first problem is, if they're not trained in music, oftentimes they use language that they think is telling you information that's helpful, but it's actually not. And like dancers in particular speak really differently about music.
Tempo, 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 tempo. That's their.
Yeah, and also like I remember I was accompanying a dance class once, and like I was trying to follow when they were landing on the ground, right? That felt like the beat, and of course I totally screwed them up because their muscles are actually executing when they leave the ground, not when they land. Exactly. So it's a really it's just a different physical relationship, and with film it's the same thing, right? There's this visual medium, and so the sound has a slightly different relationship. And I think what happens is that occasionally if they work with temp music, they fall in love with the temp music, and then it's very hard for them to hear anything else because they've danced 500 times to that song that they were practicing with. Or they've seen the scene.
Muscle memory,
yeah, exactly. They've seen the scene 10 different times with that music in the background that was originally temporary, but now it's hard for them to imagine anything else. So there have been times where I delivered what I thought we were talking about, and they were like, whoa, this is really different. And then it wasn't until like a month later that I heard from them. They're like, yeah, I kind of fell in love with your score, but it took some getting used to because it's not what they were expecting.
That's actually the same thing that happens to me. I conducted live ballet one time in my life. It was a few years back. And the piece that they had been performing to, or they had been rehearsing to, let's say, was, I think it was Cleveland Orchestra, George Zell, Schumann 2. And we're doing the fourth movement. So they had created a muscle memory of that tempo for I don't know how long. And I come in conducting that piece. I'm not an interpreter at that point. I have to be the recording.
Right, exactly.
And I feel like I did pretty well. I think I was, if not identical, I was pretty close. And then there was one dancer at the end that was like, Vlad, that part was supposed to be quarter note equals, I don't know, 65. I felt like it was 66 today. I was like, oh my God, how can you possibly? And it's a very different story when you're judging it with your ear versus the muscle memory in your entire corpus of creation over here.
Yep.
So it goes to show you the worlds that we live in, the kinds of challenges we have.
That's super interesting.
Well, here's another question. And this is geared more towards a composer at this point. Mm-hmm. Does a composer's inspiration come in the form of sound, color, feeling? Mm-hmm. Do you have a story in mind? And what is a typical aha moment for you?
Oh boy.
My first thought went to Alexander Scriabin. When I saw the word color, I said, okay, synesthesia, there's a whole story with that one, but I'm wondering for you.
Yeah, it's so different for every composer. For me personally, I'm a little bit of an oddball. I think my okay, all right. I think my relationship with listening to music and now with writing music has always been very physical, and physical in the sense of like, what does it look like and feel like to produce the actual sounds I'm asking for on the instrument, but also from the audience perspective, what is the sort of psychological choreography of what's happening? So for instance, I remember from the time I was really young, when I hear sounds like in an orchestra, something going from the strings to the horns, there's this sort of sense of from up close to really far away that I noticed, the sort of the choreography of the space changing. And when I was doing my doctorate, that's part of the reason that I went to UCSB, was I wanted to study psychoacoustically what's happening when you go from the strings to the horns. And for instance, in a situation like that, your ears are literally being tricked into thinking that that sound that was right here is being moved across a field, because the horn spectra, the sound of the horn, is what happens when you take the rich sound of the violins and you throw them far away, is the air filters out those high frequencies, and what you're left with is the root and the first and the second partial.
Holy.
Right. So there's actually a physical, like I call it an invisible dance. There's an invisible choreography that's happening with the sound. And for me, that's always the thing that I've felt when I'm listening to music, is left to right, forward and back, up and down, brighter, colder and darker. Sound changes when the air is hot and humid, and it changes when it's dry and cold. And I think that we're actually very attuned to hearing those things. And that's always what I've heard. So when I'm imagining a piece, it usually comes to me in a sort of dance,
Uh-huh.
you know?
Well, and this kind of leads actually into our next question is, at what point, if there even is such a point, at what point do you feel like I am done with this work?
No,
This work is complete.
no.
There's no such thing. I figured there, yeah. It's like with
so
conducting. I don't think
tough.
there's ever a point where I can say I can
Right.
now conduct this work and that's it.
Exactly. I
And
mean,
I'm always afraid of every work at the end of the day because there's so much more to do with it.
yeah, exactly. I think that it's so hard to ever feel like a piece is really done. But I will say, I think because of course I have the unfortunate and fortunate luxury of like saying things oftentimes to students when I'm teaching them that I then realize I have to do myself. And the thing I tell students is your piece is done when it is a really, really good at communicating what you're trying to do, when it's effective. Whatever your musical ideal was that you're trying to communicate, does it communicate it? And once you've gotten the junk out of the way that's distracting from it, and it's sort of the most pure effective representation of what you're trying to say, then I think the piece is done. You might be able to do things that make it even more effective, but
Yeah.
if it is effectively saying what it wants, at that point, the piece can be done. So I try to follow that myself. Of course, it's really hard because you get to know your own piece in a really different way when you're writing it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to judge sometimes.
It's interesting with conducting pieces because you're always taught in academia that the conductor ideally should be the advocate for the composer.
Right.
And I got to thinking to myself, and I took a course on this actually one time about kind of the esoteric of music. And the professor posed a really interesting question, I guess, about that, which is which composer, the composer who wrote the piece that was written down at that moment, the composer who revisited it maybe a week later and said, or a month later, or 10 years later, or a lifetime later in some cases when they completely revised a piece.
Right.
You know, there's no, I feel like there's no concrete piece of music. All it is just an individual reproduction at any given point.
Absolutely. And I think that's really the value of working with living composers, because when I do conduct, it's usually with student composers or composers that are alive who can be in the room. And for me, that's really liberating because you can turn and say, this is falling flat. What are you trying to get at here? And then problem solve with them about like, well, if you're trying to make it really grinding, what if we put it, Ponticello, so it's a little bit brighter? You can problem solve in a way that like it's impossible to ask those questions of a score with no composer alive. And I think it's why the recordings that I always like the best are the ones where the conductor actually worked with that composer.
That is interesting. Yeah. Like I think those are the most, not the most interesting, I'd say, but let's say the most, what's a word? The most faithful to the spirit of music itself, which is a collaboration.
Exactly.
You can't do that with a dead composer, unfortunately. Yeah. With a dead composer, you're kind of, you're stuck with tradition more than anything else. And it's got its pluses and its minuses. It's fun to conduct a piece that you've heard 100 times, but it's also intimidating as heck because there's so much that's already been done with it. What can you do at this point?
Right.
What can you keep on doing? What can you keep on adding?
Yeah.
That's kind of the pressure of conducting, I think, is always being forced to come up with these new and incredible I mean, there aren't too many ways to say loud.
Yeah, right.
Everyone likes to say there's so many gradations of loud. There are actually a finite number of them. Mm-hmm. And they've most likely been done to this point,
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting. There are conductors that I've seen, like Lako out here, for instance. I think that with the traditional repertoire, they have found, partially because they're a real chamber orchestra, right? But they occasionally will perform works that I've seen so many times, like Beethoven symphonies, and they'll find something new in it, and it's really incredible. But for me, that's the exciting part of hearing a piece that I already know, is when they find something new in it.
And when they have the courage to do something new, even if it's not on the page.
Exactly. And I think also with both living composers and, you know, the sort of traditional canon, I personally, and I'm sure other composers would disagree with me, but I would much rather a conductor takes risks
I was just going to ask that
on my
question.
piece.
How do you prefer if a conductor or a performer, whatever it is, um, may, let's say adds something to your piece that you didn't put there yourself?
Yeah, I mean,
That's something that you feel insulted about, or I guess it depends on how big the addition is.
well, I would never feel insulted by. I think what you said earlier really resonated with me, which is, you know, the as a conductor, there's this burden of history, right? And I think that with a new piece, I I would rather strongly disagree with something a conductor is doing and have a conversation about that disagreement than have a very disciplined performance of my work. Because like at the end of the day, I don't really care about the notes on my page happening. What I want is the music to happen. And if a conductor who knows their orchestra, who knows their musicality can go, man, this is weird. It just doesn't work for me. Can we try it really quiet?
Yeah.
I love it. Or can we just do just the first half the cellos on that bass line there? I mean, I remember seeing great conductors change techniques and be like, the last note's going to be pitched just like the opening on well-known pieces, you know?
Yeah.
And I love that. I think it's great because disagreement on pieces is how you find new amazing things in them. And so yeah, for as a composer, I would love for my works to be taken into a conductor's hands where um, even if they miss the mark, it's musical to them.
Yeah.
It's also why I think it's sometimes a bad idea to have composers conduct their own works. Not all the time, but it can be really. Composers get they don't have the luxury of hearing their piece from the audience's perspective because they know it. And so everything is clearer, everything is balanced differently, everything makes more sense in their head than it may actually be making sense out in the room.
Yeah.
So it's helpful. It's helpful to have someone else take your score, go through it, and you have to hear it back through someone else's interpretation. Like you said, it's about a living collaborative art. And I think that a conductor should bring their sense of musicality to, you know, to a piece.
Well, that makes me feel good. Say because it's tough. There was actually an interesting there was a study at one point about job satisfaction.
Right.
And symphony musicians, from what I heard, ranked somewhere third from the bottom. I think they were above I think beer delivery truck, and I don't know what else was there. And at the same time, chamber music musicians ranked at the top. And I think the difference is exactly this point that we're making. Chamber musicians get to make their own decisions.
Yeah.
A smaller group of people, and they, I think, have much more of a conscious role in what happens in what their product is.
Mm-hmm.
Symphony musicians, more often than not, will just sit down and listen to what a conductor has to say.
Yeah.
So conductors, I would imagine, have a much higher job approval, job satisfaction.
Well, and
musicians, it's a tough job because they're trained their entire lives to have really complex and important musical thoughts, and they don't get to express them.
Well, and also I think that occasionally there's this sense that the section is supposed to just fill out the sound of their principal player. And in some ways that's helpful for a lot of rep, but it also means that your job is to keep an eye on your principal and sort of follow along, versus in chamber music, with a string quartet, you're so exposed, you can't do
you're
that.
You're a soloist, yeah.
Yeah, you are responsible and have ownership of bringing your line to life. And I think that's true of chamber. It's especially true of jazz, right? Where there's an element of choice. What do you play? How do you voice it? What substitutions do you do? I think some of the greatest musicians alive right now are people like Brad Meldau, who's a jazz pianist. And when you listen to his solo stuff's incredible, but when he's in the background and you listen to the choices he makes, it's unbelievable. It's so carefully and thoughtfully each choice that he makes, how he's listening to the lead player, and And so, yeah, I think with chamber music and other styles like jazz in particular, it's really, really freeing for the player. And
Yeah.
I think that it'd be great to get us, the pieces that I love the most are the pieces for orchestra that recapture that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of pieces like by Barrio,
Oh, yeah.
Ludoslavsky, I think creates this sense of urgency that every player is sort of coming through. I don't know. Anyway, that's my.
Well, here's another interesting question, and this will kind of turn us a little bit towards
Mhm.
music education. In terms of music education, has anybody matched Bernstein's contribution and overall skill in bringing music to the general public?
Interesting.
And that really ties in closely to what I'm trying to do with this series, and what so many others are doing online these days.
Yeah.
My answer to that is it's really interesting because it comes with a long story. So Bernstein's programs, for those that don't know, those were aired, I think, in the 60s,
Mm-hmm.
around time like the 60s or the 70s, and they were aired around the world,
Hmm.
including in at the time communist countries like Romania was, where they only received a certain number of channels. So like my parents, when they were kids, and their friends of their age this was one of the only programs that they were allowed to watch.
Interesting.
So they got to understand classical music because of Bernstein.
It's fascinating.
You know, which is a very different story than now. Now you go on YouTube and you have KGS Music Appreciation Series and hundreds of others, all kinds of incredibly skilled and incredibly thoughtful ways of expressing music history, music theory, and so on, and access to just watching all kinds of orchestras.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a completely different world right now. But I guess, is there so like another way to sum up this same question is, what could we do, you think, in this day and age that Bernstein did for his time?
Whoa.
Or overall, what are your thoughts, I guess, of everything you just heard?
Do you mean sort of specifically for like outreach, educational outreach about?
Yeah. Let's say specifically for music outreach.
Yeah.
There's a whole list of things you could talk about Bernstein, but specifically his programs for music education and how they reached a wider audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can say here in LA, one of the things that I think I've really admired about music education is it trying to break down some of the socioeconomic barriers. You know, we have like the Youth Orchestra of LA. Mm-hmm. Of course, Dudamel's involved with things. I think it was based on the Venezuelan model, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, but for me, that's the most important effort I think that we can be making right now, because in some ways classical music becomes something where people believe that it's for certain people, or that it's stuffy, or that there's all these thoughts that people have about classical music. And the truth is, you know, the way people talk about Beethoven, you know, Beethoven was crazy. And when you listen to his music now, it may sound one way because we've heard it so many times on the radio and in soundtracks, and you know, you had to learn it when you had your first piano lessons. But the truth is, I mean, it's impossible if you really listen to the late quartets, the late piano sonatas. I mean, this is a man confronting death, confronting, you know, losing his hearing. Like, there's a lot of humanity, universal humanity in those pieces. And I think that the more that we can bring that to people, to everyone, and destigmatize what it means to play classical music, I think is a really important thing. And also, I'll say that I think for the music itself, it's a really valuable thing. I mean, I was really saved by classical music. I remember the first time I heard Pierrot Lunaire, and I heard Schoenberg, and so many students in the class had this weird, they were like, it's so weird, they didn't love it. And for me, I had this really strong sense of like, oh, this was written for me. Like, this was this amazing little postcard that was left for me from across countries, across centuries. Like, music has a way of reaching out and sort of connecting human to human without there being a physical connection there, without there being the bounds of time or space. And so the music is really important. But then I think beyond that too, understanding craft is a really valuable skill. And whether people go on to be a musician, or they go on to be an accountant, or they go on to be a director, whatever they're doing, learning what it means to invest in something so deeply that the details become more precious, really spending the time with something, I think is a valuable skill. I think it makes us better humans. And so bringing us more opportunities across the whole economic and, you know, political and gender divides. And there's work being done on that. But I do think that's the most important thing we can do right now is allow, enable people of all different voices and types to have those skills to communicate and to connect with one another.
Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting you brought up Pierrot Lunaire, because that kind of leads me into my next question is, at some point with this series, I'd like to kind of break down the musical periods. What is the Baroque?
Mm-hmm.
What is the Renaissance? What is classical? So on. And kind of what are the attributes of that?
Yeah.
And one theme that I kind of always recur to is these terms that we talk about now in the musical vernacular were never applied at the time. These are always musicological things that were applied after the fact, so we can make sense of what on earth happened from this period to this period to this period. So,
right.
And the way that it's looking now, so we have the classical period, roughly the 18th century, romantic period, roughly the 19th century, and there were things before that, obviously. Mm-hmm. But then contemporary music. Right. And every little division and subdivision since the 19th century is this one huge block called contemporary music. And maybe some people now say 20th century music and contemporary music. But I guess I wonder, in your opinion as a composer, what should the next division be? Do we even have a division anymore? Is there something that now characterizes the 20th century or a part of the 20th century, you know, versus right now, 21st century? And maybe where are we going from here?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, there are so many books that try to put 1,000 different labels on everything that's happened since 1913, right? For me, I think when I think about modern music, and I would consider that like basically starting kind of in a soft way back at the Rite of Spring is noise as an expressive device, because there's stuff happening in the Rite of Spring, and it's happening in other pieces too, but that's a well-known example where the effectiveness is not always being communicated through harmony or orchestration alone. It's the noise, it's the grit, it's very visceral. It's also, I don't think communicating, it's not communicating in necessarily the same sort of ways that earlier music was communicating. Something about it for me that's a little different. And so, yeah, I know there's authors that have tried to put 15 different labels on all these styles of music. I've never been totally convinced by that.
Yeah. Or I guess we're going to find out in about 500 years or so.
Yeah.
When they look back at this period and say, how can we explain all of this to our students? Which is essentially what we do with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one category I would say, and it's because like I studied this, like I was sort of involved in learning from people who were directly a part of that tradition, is the American experimentalism tradition. To me, is a useful phrase because it's embodying people who are trying to fundamentally communicate in a different way. And I'm not just talking about using electronics and computers, but I also mean tearing down the need for music to be rhetorical, right? Mm-hmm. That the composer has your attention from this bar to this bar, and instead sort of asserting control in some places and then releasing control in others. I think when we think about, you know, Boulez and Cage were alive at the same time. And those are two people who, Boulez had this way of creating these incredibly, you know, intricate, detailed, and controlled.
I would say super controlled.
Very, very controlled.
Every dynamic, right? Every note, every rhythm.
Yeah, and it's like, I remember describing it as like, I feel like when I listen to Boulez or look at those scores, it's like you're riding a horse and it's this very virtuosic ride through an obstacle course. And then you have someone like Cage, who sometimes is getting similar effects, but rather than like riding the horse, he's setting up a fence and then letting it run wild, you know? And that sort of trying to like release having control over everything, rethinking what does it mean to write music. You know, composers were writing music in teams. Some of them were not putting their names on pieces. Music became really interchangeable with performance art. Then you had electronic stuff happening where sound was being produced that, you know, because usually with acoustic music, there's a certain amount of physical effort that's used to exert a sound, right? But then you get to electronics where it's like a tiny little turn of a dial can make something explode. It doesn't have to be rational. And so for me, the American experimental tradition is a useful distinction because it's about fundamentally rethinking what it means to make music, to listen to music, to communicate art in that way.
Do you think in the future, maybe the next 100 years or so, we might return to classical form, classical tonality? Do you think we'll see, like I think it was Prokofiev who said something like, there are still so many wonderful pieces to be written in C major.
Right.
You know, I mean, do you think, because pop music, film music, every other category of musical experience in our society is still very much tuned into that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just I don't even know what to call it, high art music. I'm not even sure what the right term is anymore, because that sounds a little highfalutin in itself.
No, but I know what you mean. I think it's about how you curate attention. And for the trend, to me, seems to be increasingly interdisciplinary, which is a lot of students want to write for film. They want to write for video games. Even the art music that's happening, like one of my favorite artists, Alexander Schubert, is doing these amazing, it's really raw, incredible music, but it always has this visual component, this like video component to it. They're very, very effective. It's almost a type of theater. And that seems to be the trend that I'm picking up. Also, if you just look at the Academy, increasingly programs are moving towards like intermedia arts or media arts and technology. And so composition is entwined with all these other types of art. Yeah. So that's the one thing. But at the same time, you know, there are people who still go back to the form of art where you're getting the audience to focus on one performer or a group of performers who are sort of throwing their all into realizing a notated piece. I think of people like Andrew Norman. I continue to see pieces of his that are in a lot of ways extremely traditional, but they're completely new.
Yeah.
And I think as long as we value as individuals, seeing people put themselves out there, as long as we value empathy, that means something to us, I think we'll always have moments where we return to the sort of classical tradition.
Awesome. Well, hey, I think we've been yakking it up here for about an hour or so. I think it's been really, we can probably keep on going forever. You know how we like to talk back and forth. But hey, I think this is a really good, first foray into what a composer conductor is about. I'm sure we can probably do this again sometime.
That'd be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brandon Rolle. This was great, and stay safe wherever you are. Keep active, I guess, in this incredibly active world, our new
walking around the house
COVID-19 world, and I guess we'll see you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much. See you next time.
Bye bye.
All right, Vlad. I'll send that.